So this is the Police Scorecard, policescorecard.org. Now, currently have data in here on over 13,000 US police departments, as well as about 3,000 sheriff's departments. So you figure there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. We have data on about 16,000. The remaining 2,000 are agencies that don't have like a primary jurisdiction. So these are like school police departments or transit police departments, but not like the primary department of a city.
Okay.
And so virtually, no matter where you live in this country, you've got data for the police department in your area. Now, you have some high-level statistics here where you can compare agencies very quickly. This is rates of police shootings. Again, this is both fatal and non-fatal police shootings. This is the most comprehensive database that exists that includes non-fatal police shootings, which is relatively new.
Yeah.
So you can see like the differences in the rates, right? You have Columbus, Newark, Detroit, Kansas City, Cleveland, that all have extremely high rates of police shootings. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have dramatically different rates in, Chesterfield, Chula Vista, Plano, Irvine, Miami, Tampa, et cetera. So again, the range here is so wide.
Yeah.
This is important for policy advocacy, because when you meet with legislators, city council members, mayors in places like St. Louis or, Orlando, Florida is here where I'm from, where they're on the high end of the spectrum. They'll tell you a whole bunch of excuses for why their city is just going to be having these outcomes, and it's not the police's fault. Maybe they'll say, this is a high crime city and our police are involved in a lot of dangerous encounters and they're using a lot of force. But what this allows you to do is actually see, even among cities that have similar crime rates, other similar factors, there's a huge variation in rates of police shootings. So something else is going on that's determining why police are using a lot more force in some of these cities than they are in others. And then there are a whole bunch of other metrics you can look at here as well, right? So you can look at taser usage rates, which again, this is data that has never been available before at the agency level. So very quickly, you can see comparative information here. But as you're scrolling down, right, you see a table that has, now these are the 500 largest police departments in the country. And these are the ones that we have fairly complete data on. So one of the things with this project is that in some cases, you get better data than in other cases. So for some agencies, they'll be more transparent. They'll publish individualized use of force data on their website. They'll have annual reports where they put out data on how many civilian complaints were there, what were the outcomes of those complaints. So the officers get disciplined. They'll have arrest data disaggregated by race and gender. They'll have more detailed data. In other places, they won't share any of that data. And the only data that you can get access to is information that they report to the FBI through the Uniform Crime Report that's published, the arrest totals that are published on that website, information that they report to the Census Bureau on local government spending. So you could get like police budget information that way. So there are sources for data, even if the department won't give you information, but you're more limited in what you have access to and the comparisons that you can make. So one of the things you see here is there's an aggregate score. So of the departments in the scorecard, they get a score that ranges from 0 to 100%. Now, what does that mean? A 0 means that the department is worse on average across all the metrics than every other department in the sample. So every other department of a similar type and size population.
Okay.
That means if you're in a city of over 250,000 population, then you're being compared to every other city of over 250,000 population in the country. If you are in a smaller, like more rural area, less than 50,000 population, you're being compared to every other city of less than 50,000 population. If you're talking about a sheriff's department at the county level, you're compared to every other sheriff's department of that size population. So trying to make these apples to apples comparisons, it is different when, like a New York City, Chicago, it's like a different dynamic than like a police department that has like 1 or 2 officers.
Yeah.
So trying to make sure that we're not making apples to oranges comparisons here. So if you click, let's say, we look at Chicago, for example. Chicago has one of the lowest scores of any department in the country. Now, like, what does that mean? Well, when you click on a city, you see each of the metrics in like one dashboard, one table. Now, just to like give you a sense of how agencies are compared, there are a set of common principles that guide how each of these agencies are being compared. And the attempt here was to try to abstract out from a lot of the theoretical conversations and to just land on a set of principles that seem to be shared in common across the political spectrum. So the idea that police ought to be, like, if police exist at all, whatever agency exists. So again, even if it's an alternative agency that's not a police department, if a community member calls that agency to respond to an issue, that agency should respond in a way that, number one, minimizes the amount of harm caused to the civilian. So the least amount of force possible, hopefully none. Two, that minimizes disparities. There should be no disparities in treatment depending on race, for example. Number three, it should be accountable. If the community member reports that responder for engaging in some sort of misconduct, there should be a high likelihood that that person is held accountable. And then finally, the overall approach of that agency should be to focus on things that are actual public safety threats, like actual violence against people, and not to be over-indexing on just responding to and intervening in people's lives for low-level nonviolent issues. And then finally, it should be able to do all those things at the best value to the taxpayer as possible, at the lowest cost possible. Those are like the principles. So this is consistent with like defunding and abolishing the police, right? Because we want to gradually shrink the size and scope of the police force as we also maintain and as we also maintain a focus on improving the other metrics. But also it's consistent with a host of other frameworks, just like basic like government efficiency and accountability standards. And so that's like the overall framework. And using these various metrics, like the size of the police budget, the number of officers, the amount of force used, the amount of deadly force used, the racial disparities, the likelihood of officers being held accountable, arrest rates, and what those arrests were for, we're able to actually align a department's performance against that common framework. Okay. So that's ultimately like the framework that's being used to evaluate. And in Chicago, which you can see in the scorecard, is the agency performs worse than almost every other agency on most metrics. Right. So the agency costs more than 93% of other large city police departments. The agency is imposing higher fines and fees on residents than 97% of other large cities. There are more police officers on the Chicago Police Department than 98% of other large cities per capita. There are larger racial disparities in police use of force than 98% of other large city police departments. What that means is a Black person is 22 times more likely to be killed by police in Chicago than a white person. On accountability metrics, 0% of complaints of police discrimination result in any type of accountability against officers. So again, like this is among the worst outcomes of any police department in the country, but we're able to say that actually in a way that is data driven and is grounded in this framework.
Right. Right. And then earlier you were pointing out the fact that cities or departments are compared to peer departments, so similar size of the city or jurisdiction. And I'm just curious if that also then helps with this issue of data that you can get versus data that you can't, right? Do you find that the smaller places tend to be missing the same type of data? Because that is, I know, is a question that has come up with the missing values.
Yes.
For some,
so you can, on the scorecard, you can pick any state and see all of the agencies within that state. One of the things that you'll see, to your point, is a lot of the smaller agencies don't have complete data. So let's say we go to, I don't know, maybe we'll go to Colorado. Now in Colorado, it automatically goes to the largest agency in the state. You scroll down, you can see the table. And you can see that in the table, the agencies that have the score in gray are agencies where we don't have enough data. Now, what that means is that we lack data for the majority of indicators that we're looking at here. And now the reason for that, as I said earlier, is there are a couple of federal data collection efforts that do collect pretty comprehensive data around a set of issues that are very limited. The US Census Bureau has a data collection around how much money city governments are spending across the country. So that's police budgetary information. And every city over something like 10,000 population is required to report that every year to the Census Bureau. So we have good data on that. The uniform crime report. So while the federal government doesn't collect good data on people who are killed by the police from the nation's 18,000 agencies, they still manage to collect and report data every single year on arrests and crime from those exact same agencies without issue. So just think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Right. Because of that, we have, arrest data, we have data on arrest disparities, we have data on homicide clearance rates, et cetera, from almost every city. So there are a set of sort of baseline metrics that we are able to get data on from pretty much every city. But for some of the other metrics, right, for non-fatal force, that's public records requests to individual agencies, some of which accept and respond, some of which deny those requests. For information on police accountability, that's even harder to get because in some states, it's prohibited by law for the state to share that information. There are police bill of rights laws. These are special laws designed to shield the police from accountability. There are 20 states that have these laws, and in many of those states, information on police discipline, police accountability, complaints of police misconduct and what happens to them, all that information is considered part of an officer's personnel file, their private file, and not part of information that we could get access to through public records requests. So those are the structural and systemic barriers that actually make it really difficult and have probably, this is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of projects like this, because it's extremely difficult to get good data from enough agencies to make meaningful comparisons. And so in this context, for big cities, we actually have pretty good data for most of them. So for about 89 of the 100 largest cities, and for the vast majority of the 500 largest cities, we do have solid data, and they've responded to the public records request, and we found that data through information they've otherwise posted online. But outside of that, it gets a little bit more dicey. That's really where you have these smaller agencies, 1 or 2 officers. They don't even have anybody on staff who digitizes the records. So a tray of 1,000 documents that you then have to manually go through, code up, and then ultimately visualize. So that's sort of the work moving forward. So here we are at Denver. So looking at this table here, this table is really where I would get started, right? You click on, you go to the scorecard, you go to your state, find your city, and then what you'll see here is a table that just puts all of the different metrics in conversation with one another, right under the city name. And basically, the way to read this is the things coded in red are the things that are really outliers for this department. Are the things where this department is worse than 2/3 of other departments of similar size. And when we look at a place like Denver, what you can see is that there is that Denver, for example, uses deadly force at a rate higher than 71% of other departments. So a 29% score means that 71% of other departments have a better outcome. So deadly force, obviously a big focus. Arrest rate for low-level offenses is another outlier for Denver, where you have 69% of other departments have a lower arrest rate for low-level offenses. And then also fines and forfeitures, right? So in Denver, 81%, in Denver, 91% of other agencies have a lower rate per capita of imposing fines and fees on residents. So all of that means, right, you have a police department that in particular, among all the things, in particular is using deadly force at higher rates, is arresting a lot more people for low-level offenses and imposing a lot more fines and tickets and fees on people. And that's a particular narrative that's telling a story about what's happening in Denver using the data. And now that you have that information, you can go to the mayor, city council members, police chief, and say, for example, that when looking at police use of force data, we're seeing here that Denver Police Department is killing people at a rate higher than 71% of other police departments. And when we look at the disparities here, we can see that there is a disparity, that Black people, that Latinos are more likely to be killed by police than white people. When we scroll down further, we can see that when we look at low-level arrests, 66% of all arrests that are made by the police department are for low-level offenses. So again, that gives you real data to go into those conversations and say, what is going to be your approach to reducing arrests for low-level offenses? And then what you'll likely get in response is a pre-baked narrative from the police department about why they can't do that, right? So they'll say, there's a lot of crime and we're making a lot of arrests because we're encountering a lot of crime, or there's a lot of public disorder and residents are calling us a lot. And so we have to respond to them. And that's why we're making so many low-level arrests. And if we stopped, crime would go through the roof. That's like the narrative. So they'll say that. And so what I would then do is you can go to the findings, right? You can go and see how these theories stack up. So one of the things in the findings page of the police scorecard is we look at some of these trends over time. One of the things that you see in terms of the trends over time is that there's been a pretty huge reduction in arrests for low-level offenses in big cities since about going back to 2013 through 2019 or 20. The 2020 data just came in, but it shows a further reduction in low-level arrests, in part because of the pandemic. So you see in big cities, a 38% reduction in low-level arrests. You see which cities are having the largest reductions in low-level arrests. So, Denver is over here. Denver actually increased low-level arrests by 11% between 2013 and 2019. It was one of the only large cities that did that. Almost every city cut low-level arrests. New York City cut them 62%. So a huge reduction. You have some cities, Milwaukee, 78% reduction in low-level arrests. Now, what is interesting about that is that these cities had these huge reductions in low-level arrests. The cities that reduced low-level arrests actually saw a decrease in crime relative to cities that increased low-level arrests. Cities that reduced low-level arrests saw a decrease in police shootings relative to cities that increased low-level arrests. And the cities that reduced low-level arrests saw a smaller increase in murder than cities that did not. So murder increased across the board, but increased more in cities that increased low-level arrests than it did in cities that cut them. So that cuts right through the police narrative, right? Like you could that data. So first step is get the data from the scorecard, right? Understand what are the issues that you want to talk about? What do you want to focus on? Where are the issues where this particular city is an outlier in a bad way, or maybe in a good way that could then be a conversation about what might be working to scale to other outcomes. Then go to the next phase, which is preparing for that conversation about those outcomes. You'll want to know what the police will say in response, what the city will say to try to defend themselves, and how you can use data and the analysis piece of this as a tool to help overcome some of those common roadblocks in the conversation and get to a conversation about what really works. So that's sort of how to use the data to help orient your strategy. So if you're in a police department, if you're in a city that, for example, has an extremely high rate of arresting people, but a relatively low rate of using force per arrest. What that means is the primary issue might be just the overall number of arrests that police are making, right? This low-level arrest conversation, usually it's arrests for low-level offenses. And reducing the overall number of arrests could reduce police shootings and other issues as well. But if the police are using force at an extreme rate per arrest, you could reduce arrests and the police department will still be an outlier in use of force. So you've got something to actually focus specifically on use of force, restricting police discretion to use force, increasing accountability structures to hold them accountable to enforcing those standards, taking away the ability of police, for example, to use particular types of weapons against people. In some places, they're banning tasers. In some places, they are piloting alternative approaches to particular situations, so mental health crises, et cetera. So all of this is these are various options, right? There are a lot of solutions that sort of bubble up as ideas. What this can be is a data-driven roadmap for figuring out which of those ideas might make the most sense in your particular city. And then ultimately, as we update this year over year, you can track whether those changes actually are making a difference.